From National Review headquarters in New York City, this is a Capital Writing author interview. Capital Writing is a project of National Review Capital Matters and is part of our mission to explain, defend, and celebrate capitalism. Our guest today is Garett Jones. Dr. Jones is a professor in economics at George Mason University. He was actually one of my professors at George Mason University, and his book is called The Culture Transplant: How Migrants Make the Economies They Move to a Lot Like the Ones They Left. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Jones.
Thanks for having me here, Dominic. Great to be here.
All right. So your book is, you seem to be sticking with a theme of only writing controversial books. Your previous two are as well. And this one's about immigration mostly. It's about how people, when they move to a new place, what it does to that place and what it does to them. And you do this in a really thorough way, I think, based on a lot of the research that's just out there. Very mainstream scholarly research, but comes to a lot of conclusions, I think, that are not necessarily mainstream. And so what do you think, in the title, The Culture Transplant, what do you mean by a transplant? Why is that the word that you chose for what happens when someone moves to a new country?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when you think about research by modern economists on how migration changes societies, for instance, one term Daron Acemoglu uses is neo-Europes. When Europeans moved to the New World, they did not assimilate to the cultural norms, to the institutional norms of the people they moved, who were already there, right? They violently imposed new rules, right? And that's why we call these countries, whether it's the U.S. or Canada or New Zealand, refer to them as neo-Europes. The question is whether this is sort of a generalizable phenomenon, something that's happened in many places, not just in a couple places where there were these imperialistic violent conquests. And here, there's a literature that looks at this question of whether migrants carry their attitudes from their home country to their new country. And a couple of my favorite papers look at savings behavior. When migrants come from a low savings rate culture that places low value on thrift compared to other values, do they bring those low savings rates on average and pass them on to the second and third generation of migrants? So my book really isn't about first generation migrants very much at all. It's really about the children and grandchildren of migrants. So it's really a long-termist sort of book. It turns out that whether we're looking at savings rates, attitudes toward trust, views on labor market regulation, people tend to pass on values and carry them from the country of origin to the grandchildren of the people, pass them on to the grandchildren of the people that move to those countries. Italian Americans are a lot like Italians in Italy. Swedish Americans are a lot like Swedes in Sweden. So there's a partial and persistent culture transplant for many traits that are important for the wealth of nations.
A couple of the ones that you mentioned are social trust, levels of how much you just trust strangers in society. You talk about savings rates, which you just mentioned. You also talk about family values, and these are things that seem to transfer very strongly and seem to stay with people when they move. What are some other ones that have that strong relationship and permanence?
Well, here's one that was actually kicked off the literature. It's not central to my book, but I think it might be interesting because it's so easy to test. And it has to do with fertility rates and gender differences in labor market participation, right? So part of the way this literature kicked off was people checked to see in countries where there are big gender gaps between the rates of men and women working in the workforce. Do the children and grandchildren of migrants tend to import those attitudes toward gender differences into their new countries? So rather than just asking people some survey question like, do you believe in gender equality? You just check and see. Do people from countries with high rates of labor market equality between the genders import those attitudes and pass them on to their children when they move to a new country? And that was where this kicked off, is finding out that there was like moderate but substantial noticeable differences. So again, not just looking at the migrants, looking at the children of migrants, looking at the adult children of migrants. This shows up with gender differences in labor market participation, gender difference, and cross-country differences in fertility. So this doesn't so between that and the savings rate issue, we're looking at concrete behaviors. We're not just looking at, well, what do you think about this or that? So it's showing up in the things we can measure and the things that are more political or values type questions.
And then obviously not everything is going to come across, and some, and we know, I mean, just from experience, that people move to a new country, that they change as well. What are some of the things that maybe have a weaker relationship and people are more likely to change when they move?
Oh, so particularly there's this European study that looks at intra-European migration, and that finds some quite a few results where things don't persist very much at all. And one of them is basically like, how do you feel about migrants, right? That one doesn't persist very much at all because probably people bring their first generation attitudes and then they kind of fade away. But another one is basically, how do you feel about the police? How do you feel about trust in different local organizations? I'm forgetting one particular question about religion. I don't want to get the question wrong. But there are some attitudes persist and some don't. And so there's a degree of persistence. I'm not monolithic about this. Some are super persistent across generations. We usually can check it most reliably to the second, sometimes beyond. And sometimes there really is assimilation, right? So my colleague Brian Kaplan likes to point out, migrants assimilate on language, right? By the second, third generation, right? There's just a lot of assimilation on language. So that's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm interested in the traits that more reliably shape the wealth of nations, attitudes toward government regulation, savings. These things keep showing up. So,
one of those other things that has evidence on both sides that you talk about in the book is the concept of, is diversity a good thing in and of itself? And you say there's research that shows that some kinds are and some kinds are not. So can you explain that?
Yeah. I try to stick to business research and to research within firms because it's easiest to know exactly what you're measuring. And to glibly sum up a big business literature on diversity, the aphorism that they use sometimes is not the popular aphorism that our diversity is our strength, but instead they use the phrase, diversity is a double-edged sword. And you know what a double-edged sword is? It means it can cut both ways. I'd say it seems like the strongest evidence at this point is that skills diversity on a team is very valuable. So if you're trying to make a big decision in your corporation, you probably want to have a tech person and an HR person and a management person, maybe a hard science person, and have them all work together, right? And everybody can bring their own unique skills to the game. Ethnic diversity is either neutral to negative, depending on the study. It's a little bit hard to tell. But overall, the view that skills diversity is a plus on teams within the business world and ethnic diversity is neutral to minus, that seems important. Certainly at other times and places, religious diversity would have been huge, right? Just think about Europe in the 15 and 1600s. So some of these diversity questions can rise and fade in importance over the centuries, obviously. But the claim that ethnic diversity is unambiguously a strength, or we can make it a positive strength if only we watch the right PowerPoint videos, that seems to be the triumph of hope over experience, just like second marriages.
A point that you make that I think is really strong and is something that people often confuse is the difference between people and place. And and you make, we look at comparisons across countries, and the temptation is to think, oh, there's something special about that place. There's something special about that plot of land, that territory controlled by whatever government, and that brings in questions about natural resources and geography and all these sort of things. And there's something to that, but what you say is almost always what is more important is the people that live there.
Yeah, the history of peoples matters more than the history of places. That's the way it's often summed up in the literature. More than one professor has said it that way. When economists, whether we're being fancy or being very simple and straightforward, you find a lot of evidence that one of the better predictors of how rich a country is how far it is from the equator, right? Stanford's Robert Hall and Chad Jones wrote a paper about this and just found latitude looks kind of important. Shows up in a lot of other studies as well. The joke that economists sometimes tell is that this explains why the North Pole has the most productive economy in the world, right? Because it's as far from the equator as possible. And so that's why Santa's able to get it all done, right? So the question is, when we can run a horse race between people and places, what ends up mattering? Particularly the history of people versus the history of places. And through the horrors of the international age of conquest and migration, the last 5 centuries has given the world a number of chances to test whether the history of peoples matters more than the history of places. It turns out, if you know basically what was going on in a region of the world in 1500, in particular, looking at its level of technological sophistication in the global rank ordering, right? Western Europe and China sort of at the top, South Asia doing okay, the Arab world a little bit behind there, and then the rest of the world much behind. Sub-Saharan Africa, actually, West Africa in particular, doing better than Latin America in 1500 in terms of technological sophistication. So if you're trying to predict how rich a country is today, what you'd actually want to know, not the history, the technological history of the place, but you'd want to know the technological history of the ancestors of the people who live there. So the rich places in the world, ignoring these natural resource powerhouses like Saudi Arabia, if you're trying to predict history, the prosperity of a nation today, you'd want to know what the ancestors of the folks living there were doing in 1500. And this isn't just a story of Europeans moving places, the European violent conquest. Even if you basically statistically set those folks aside, the other migrations matter too. The migrations, the violent forced migrations of people of African descent, the Chinese migrations in particular across Southeast Asia. Open borders advocates have really erased the economic successes that were created by the Chinese diaspora. I really hope they start investigating that finally and look at how the migration of people from China helped make Singapore more prosperous, helped make Malaysia more prosperous, Thailand. So it's not just a story of European conquest upending the world. That's important and can't be forgotten. But the history of peoples matters more than the history of places, even setting aside the European conquests.
Yeah, let's talk about the Chinese portion of that a little bit more, because you make a big point of this in the book. Towards the end, you say this is the third book in your Singapore trilogy because of and a big part of the story of Singapore, as you said, is Chinese migration. But you open the book by basically saying economic research shows that a pretty good economic development plan for a lot of for extremely poor countries would be to have lots of Chinese immigration, because we just know basically no matter where Chinese people move, they do quite well in whatever country they go to, and they end up making the country that they go to wealthier as well.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the evidence for that, and also about the just the success story of Chinese migration?
Yeah, a part of the reason to focus on China is because it's basically the last poor country, the last, now we'd say middle income country, that had a really high level of technological success in 1500. So the other countries that had high technological levels of success are mostly successful nowadays, except for North Korea for obvious reasons, right? So China is the last country in the world where you've got basically 1 billion people. Maybe half of them are nowhere close to middle income levels of prosperity. You might imagine a world where there'd be a large number of folks who are living in communist China who would be willing to entertain the idea of moving to a poorer country and taking a stab at life there. So if I can recommend one book on this, it's China's Second Continent. It's by a New York Times reporter, and he reports on Chinese migration to sub-Saharan Africa and how they're changing, how these Chinese migrants in various ways, different sectors of the economy, how they're creating new stories and building an economic success there that is important. And it's on a small scale compared to Southeast Asia, but it's still noteworthy. So yeah, this is across Southeast Asia. If you want to, it's well known that the Chinese migrants, on average, many exceptions, have become what maybe Chua of Yale refers to as market-dominant minorities, right? So, whether we're talking about Malaysia or Indonesia or Thailand or the Philippines, the Chinese minority communities there are disproportionately economically successful, disproportionately likely to be billionaires, disproportionately likely to be um, leaders of large successful industries that are engaged in a lot of international trade. And this is something. So this isn't just a story about U.S. Chinatowns, as important as they are. The U.S., of course, would have done much better in the 19th century if we had welcomed Chinese migrants rather than imposing the racist exclusion acts. Um, but the U.S. was a country that was already kind of destined for some level of economic success by then. The rest of the world could use a dose of that level of success, right? And so it's worth remembering China is by far the poorest majority Chinese country in the world, right? We have Singapore, we have Hong Kong, rest in peace, we have Macau, we have Taiwan. We have four other countries that are majority Chinese, all much more successful. I think that's a signal for us about the ability of Chinese folks when they're not under the thumb of a communist dictatorship, whether we want to just call it a communist authoritarian system, but depending on the jargon. So when they're in the majority, we see strong market-friendly countries that do well on economic freedom ratings that libertarians rightly value. And when you look at countries where there's substantial minority members of the community, there's a fairly good correlation between percent of Chinese ancestry by multiple measures and levels of prosperity, levels of economic freedom. Chinese diaspora is creating miracles around the world. And if there's one thing the world needs more, it's more economic miracles.
Mm-hmm. And so your book is not a open borders. You would not support open borders like some people would, but clearly you don't support closed borders totally
Not at all.
either.
It's ridiculous. Yeah.
Yeah.
Poorest countries in the world, in particular, should be trying to find ways to welcome voluntary, peaceful migration from people who can bring skills, whether it's traditional human capital measures or whether it's parents and grandparents' experiences living under market-based free societies with good institutions. This is one way to create success, is to just bring in people who have a great experience with success.
Mm-hmm.
And since we know from this, what's called the deep roots literature, that many of these traits persist across generations, maybe even centuries, then this is a reminder that a country can help steer its own economic destiny by choosing its migration policy now.
Mm-hmm. And so that's really just an argument for a relatively conventional immigration policy of we're going to have a border, we're going to enforce it, but we're also going to choose who we want to come in subject to a certain set of criteria.
So think of the traditional, the kind of points-based systems that are used in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, a few other countries, where you get points if you have skills that are needed in your country, if you have high education levels, if you have some kind of technical certifications, no criminal record, these kind of things. So points-based systems work a little like college admissions, where nobody's going to worship one particular number or have one ironclad cutoff. So some of my critics make up these scenarios where if you use a ridiculous ironclad cutoff, you get ridiculous outcomes. And I'm like, yeah, of course, that's why you wouldn't do that. So points-based systems are a better way to think about it. And the traditional merit-based or skills-based migration, I have no particular qualm with that. But I'm here to point out that those are metrics that look at the first generation, right? I'm a migrant. I'm thinking of moving to Japan. If I can show them I have a PhD, I have a pretty good chance of getting some kind of visa to live there. But what are my children and grandchildren going to be like if I ever have any, right? That's what a country should be thinking about. It should be using whatever crummy, noisy indicators are available to give you some ability to forecast what might turn out, what might happen 2, 3, 4 generations down the road. And if we know that people who come from high trust countries are more likely to pass on high levels of trust and trustworthiness on average to their children and grandchildren, that's like a really nice thing to know. I don't care whether that transmission is cultural, meme-based, genetic. I don't know anything about that. I just know that it works in the data, right? It's a lot like I was trained in time series forecasting methods at UCSD. You can do a lot of forecasting without knowing the mechanism of action, without knowing how it works. And we know that a lot of these attitude measures persist across generations, and we should make a little bit of use of that. So on average, what country a person has come from gives us some predictive power about what their children and grandchildren will be like in the voting booth, in the marketplace, at the bank. And so we should make use of that as a small weight, I would say. Add this on as a small weight to any skills-based migration policy.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about the literature on search theory, which is part of, well accepted part of economic research. Multiple Nobel Prize winners have specialized in that. And one of the points you make there is, if you're wealthy, if you're wealthy country or wealthy individual, the cost of searching are not as big of a deal to you, and so you're able to search and find the positive outcomes. Whereas people with less resources don't necessarily have that issue. And then you take that on to the way that, say, corporate America looks at questions about diversity, and of course they think, if diversity is our strength, makes sense for them because they get to search and they get to find the cases where that is true, because there are many cases where it is true. But
yes, yeah.
But you run into the problem for, on the other end of the spectrum, if you don't have the means to go through the effort of putting in, if you don't have the means to put in the work and search for those positive outcomes, you're going to end up with more on the other side of the double-edged sword.
Yeah, at the corporate board level, it's got to be pretty clearly true that more ethnic diversity is at least as probably very likely a positive to corporate performance, partly because it's another way to get a new independent voice in the room. If there's one thing corporations often need in their boardrooms, it's someone who's outside the sort of buddy-buddy network of the corporate hierarchy, someone who can be an outside sort of, to use a crude phrase, a bullshit detector. And that kind of outside voice and outside monitor is really helpful. We impose that by law in the US. And so ethnic diversity is one proxy for getting an outside voice on a corporate board. But of course, there you're filtering, you're just looking at the best people in the world to sit on big corporate boards. So one way I sometimes put it is that if you statistically adjust for all of the possible costs of ethnic diversity, then by definition, all that's left is the positives. And so a lot of folks aren't able, a lot of poor, lower middle income folks aren't able to screen out those costs of the sort of low grade ethnic conflicts that might be showing up in these business studies of ethnic diversity. And so they're faced with the more downside part of that sort of low level social conflict. And they're not living the lives of the corporate board members who get to screen out the costs of ethnic diversity and only get the benefits.
As it relates to those sort of low-level ethnic conflicts, clearly there's, you can point to any number of examples of that all over the world. But I think it is the case, and survey data shows at least, and I think it's also true just if you observe our politics and compare it in the U.S. with some Western European countries. The U.S. has a more accepting, your average American has a more accepting attitude towards foreign immigration than the average European does.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, when you're looking in your book and you're looking across the entire world and all these different countries, is it possible that some correlations and some things that show up at the nationwide level or at the worldwide level might not show up at the nationwide level for the U.S. just because we are sort of strange?
So yeah, it's possible the U.S., especially in the last few decades, has been unusually accepting of racial diversity. It's unusually good at just making great things out of it, right? We might be an exception to the rule. Now, that said, a lot of this business research is done in the U.S. I mean, that's the modal study. But when we look across countries, there's this nice paper by Spalaure that I cite in the book. And there they find that when you see the costs at the national level of ethnic diversity, it appears to only happen when differences in ethnic diversity correlate with differences in values. That's the bad outcome. It turns out that if ethnic diversity and values diversity are unrelated to each other within a country, you don't seem to have the downside. So when you think of where ethnic conflicts come from, if you think of where cultural conflicts come from, think of the great religious wars of the past, right? I mean, that was a values issue in Western Europe for decades, right? For over a century. And there, people couldn't look at someone and tell, hey, are you Catholic or Protestant? Do you practice the wrong creed compared to me? imagine how much more powerful and deadly that conflict could have been if you could visibly identify who was Protestant or Catholic through visual markers. That would just make it much worse. So basically, ethnic diversity can be a force multiplier for the cost of values diversity, which can be a huge problem of social conflict. Western Europe's battles over the Reformation are just an illustration of that.
Yeah, that power of I think that's a point about the power of ideas, right? And
Yeah.
how that really matters. And your examples about China got me thinking about that because obviously, like you say, Chinese people outside of China are doing better than Chinese people in China, and it's because it's a communist government.
I mean, if I can point an old Milton Friedman anecdote, which is probably apocryphal, like most Milton Friedman anecdotes. Somebody's told him once, Swedes in Sweden do really great. That shows that socialism works great. And Friedman says, well, look at the Swedes in America; they're doing way better.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's a. I think it's Charles Murray said there's a long line of scholarly literature that says even really bad ideas will work for a little while in Sweden. But going back to China, the fact that China went communist in the first place is communism is a Western idea. It's not a Chinese idea. But they didn't have this forced on them by Westerners. It was forced on them by Chinese people. The Chinese Communist Party. Is this sort of just an example of how you can also have these huge cultural changes within a culture that are not the result of immigration, that are not the result of any kind of anybody else moving around, but can still have these huge effects?
Well, of course, in the Chinese case, you had Russia right next door able to arm a communist revolution. So sharing the border with a terribly evil country, the Soviet Union, that was trying to create great evil in the world, that's a bad thing to have. But yeah, there are always exceptions to every rule, right? Like I think my goal with all of my books is to say something that's true more than half the time that nobody else is talking about. And I think that's kind of what I've done. I mean, if you want to look at an exception to the rule, it's China isn't the one to look at. It's North Korea, right? 50% of all majority Korean countries are communist.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's a terrible outcome. And we all just know that if the North Koreans just flipped a switch and decided to go with capitalism tomorrow, if they were somehow able to overthrow the dictatorship there and the junta, it would be a lot like South Korea in 30, 40 years, right? It's obvious. China is one exception to the general rule at the national level. 4 out of 5 majority Chinese nations are non-communist and quite successful. 50% of majority Korean nations are non-communist and super successful. So there are always exceptions to these rules, and we should draw most of our message from the rules. Most people every year in the U.S. who die in car accidents are actually wearing their seatbelts, but you should still wear a seatbelt.
So one of the things you talk about is how both sides assimilate each other when you move to a new place, which is sort of an idea that seems really obvious, but also seems like something, like you said, is something that doesn't get discussed very much, because we're always thinking about, well, how are the immigrants going to assimilate to the country they move to? That's always the question.
Yeah.
And I think for both sides of the immigration question, I think that's always what they're thinking about.
Yes, yeah.
But you make the point, which just seems really obvious, and you use the example of spaghetti. So could you explain the spaghetti example?
Yeah, so what I call the spaghetti theory of cultural change. Italians moved to America. They became Italian Americans, and they shared their cuisine with other Americans, and so other Americans started eating more like Italians. Right? Italian Americans are something like 6% of the population. Italian restaurants are about 12% of all restaurants in the U.S. So clearly, this is something big. It's not just me imagining it. And so, what happened if you were a naive immigration activist who was doing statistical research? You'd say, wow, it looks like Italian Americans really assimilated. They eat spaghetti just like the other Americans, right? But of course, what happened is that there was a meeting in the middle. The Italian Americans changed the other Americans. So normal statistical analyses that are so popular of whether immigrants are assimilating completely omit, and it's impossible for them to detect whether the immigration is migrants becoming like the previous residents or whether there's a meeting in the middle. Let me bring up a much more important example of this. It's great news for America. The Tabellini, who's a political economist, has a recent study just came out showing that the great migration of African Americans from the South to the North, that's an internal migration, helped create the civil rights movement and get civil rights legislation passed. Why? Because they were moving from a place where it was illegal, dangerous, deadly to vote, the South, to places where it was somewhat feasible to vote, the North. And their study shows not only that local politicians were very responsive to these new African American voters and moving in their direction in policy issues, on civil rights especially, but also that they changed the views of white voters. So white voters, once more African Americans from the South moved to their region, started becoming more sympathetic toward civil rights, more sympathetic toward voting equality. And so this is part of, it's not the whole story because the migration wasn't vast enough to be a nation-shifting phenomenon. But on the margin, it's clear that the great migration of African Americans within the U.S. shifted policy and improved the racial attitudes of white Americans. So racial institutions improved because of migration. Part of that was because of a much more important version of spaghetti theory, not just changing what people eat, but changing how people feel about racial equality.
One of the examples of that always amazes me is if you just look at historical polling on attitudes towards interracial marriage.
Oh, yes. Thank God.
Not
right?
that long, really not that long ago.
Yeah,
most
exactly.
people thought that was bad. And now you can hardly find anyone who thinks that that's.
Yes. And one always wonders, are people lying about it? Or are they holding these views secretly? And there must be some people doing it. But I mean, I've been in a lot of private conversations the last few decades, and even people who are quite elderly, I don't hear them talking like this, right? People who you might think, oh, that's another generation or something. So thank God. That's been a huge improvement. So yeah.
Certainly. So you talk in the book about how only about a half dozen countries in the world do most of the world's innovation. And you talk about that. You can look at it measured by the number of patents, by the amount of spending on research and development, by the number of scholarly journal publications. All of these things show that there's basically six or seven countries that do all of this. I think you said seven.
The vast majority, yeah.
That do virtually all of this. And as a result of that, it is in the entire world's best interest that those seven countries do well, because if they have even a small decline in their quality of government or quality of business environment, it's going to lead to a lot of, a disproportionate amount of loss because they are doing a disproportionate amount of the innovation. Well, which countries are those, and what should they be doing in order to make sure that they can continue to be this engine of innovation for the world?
Yeah, I call them the I-7, the Innovative Seven, and one of them is the U.S. Three in Asia are China, South Korea, and Japan, and then three in Europe are the U.K., France, and Germany. And between these seven, you have the vast majority of the world's Nobel Prizes, patents, economically useful patents, I double check on that, and R&D, research and development. So this is a case where scale matters, where the actual amount of the population in your country really matters. Because to find a lot of gold, you need a lot of people looking for gold. And these ideas that are invented in just mostly in these seven nations, get shared the world over. So a lot of open borders advocates say, well, the benefits of migration are huge to the person who moves to the country from a very poor country. And so if there's some small cost to the people who already lived in the country, well, that's worth it, because that small loss against huge gain nets out to something huge. And I'm like, that seems reasonable to me. But what if the country where they're moving to is a global innovation powerhouse? And what if over the course of a generation or two, past patterns continue and institutional quality moves in the direction of the newest wave of migrants? Up if your migrants are coming from countries with great promise, and down if otherwise. A poorly chosen migration policy could hurt innovation in any of the I-7, and that would impose a cost on the entire world. So instead of just looking at the benefits to the migrant versus the costs to the so-called native, right? We're looking at the benefits to the migrant against the costs to the planet as a whole. And it turns out that institutional quality is incredibly important for innovation. The cross-country inequality in patenting and R&D is much bigger than cross-country inequality in income. So it's basically just a couple countries in the world that are just doing all this stuff, right? And so we really need to protect these few countries and protect their institutional quality. Well-chosen immigration policy that doesn't place institutional quality at risk is part of that. This is why I unironically suggest that open borders advocates should push for open borders for Iceland, right? Iceland's a great place, super great institutional quality. It's the size of Kentucky. You could put a lot more people there than the 300,000 who are there right now. And just thinking that through helps you realize just how much is at stake if we lose the institutional quality even slightly in the U.S., losing innovation even slightly in the U.S., because that has costs for the planet as a whole. So we should think about the world's long-run well-being, and that means protecting and improving institutional quality in the I-7.
You talk about in the book, this is one of the original things you do. I mean, a lot of the book is summarizing and synthesizing existing research, but one of the original things you do is what you call an SAT score for countries. So can you explain what the S, the A, and the T are?
Yeah. So this is a book. The Culture Transplant is really about telling people stuff that's sitting in journals that the masses, I think, need to know about. And so one of the ways I tried to explain this literature is by coming up with a memorable way to sum up a really kind of odd research agenda. So when we talk about the fact that the past is prologue and that the history of peoples matters more than the history of places, the three most important measures of basically ancestral experience are state history, how long your ancestors lived under organized states; agricultural history, which is how long your ancestors have been using settled agriculture rather than being, say, hunter-gatherers or pastoralists. And then the third is technological history. And the most important measure there is one I emphasized before. What fraction of the world's technologically sophisticated tools your ancestors were using in 1500? So we've got S, states; A, agriculture; T, technology. Together, I created the acronym of SAT as your and averaging them together to create your nation's SAT score. And there's two different teams of researchers who helped create these measures. And when they created these measures, one of the first things they checked, because they came up with them about the same time, these two teams, is they checked to see which one mattered most. And of the two, it was the T that mattered the most by far. So, which perhaps isn't a surprise, because the T measure is measured in 1500, just before Columbus's explorations ended up setting off centuries of conquest and population movements. So of the three, the T is the most important. The S and the A are important because they give us a sense that the past is prologue and the past really does help predict the future. The T is really where the action is. Things haven't changed much since 1500. They've changed a bit more when you move back further centuries in the past, right? The Arab world was at its peak, say around 1100 in the what Europeans would consider right around the peak of around the High Middle Ages, and have have not maintained that position in the technological rank ordering since then, right? So things change for the planet over the course of, say, 500-700 years, certainly over thousands of years. But over the last 300-400 years, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same.
And the SAT score correlates pretty well with average income today, right?
Yes, it does. So now, if you just do a simple average, it does pretty well. I mean, I would guess it explains a little less than half, about half of cross-country income differences. But if you just tell the computer, hey, like weight the S, the A, and the T as best you can, and see how much you can predict, that gets you up to like explaining 2/3 of what we call log differences, percentage differences in incomes across countries. So that's quite impressive by the standards of one simple indicator measuring something that happened 5 centuries ago, as long as you adjust for migration. All of these measures perform much worse if you don't adjust for migration. If you tried to predict how rich America was based on the experience of hunter-gatherers here in North America in 1500, you do a poor job predicting how prosperous it is today, right? The geography hasn't changed, the latitude hasn't changed. A bunch of Europeans came in and imposed their institutions on this land and did so quite violently.
Yeah, one of the uh, in talking about the in talking about the SAT score and talking about a lot of the different measures you use in the book and just a lot of the different research you talk about, I think to a reader who might not be familiar with this kind of social science research, they might look at some of these things and say like 50% or 2/3, like
That's
I
not
don't know,
much.
that's not
Yeah.
that good, but like
Eh.
that's actually quite good.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, there's a lot of idiosyncrasies in life, right? I mean, when I'm doing this, I'm not throwing out the countries that are natural resource rich, right? I'm not throwing out Saudi Arabia. I'm not throwing out the UAE. I'm not throwing out Qatar, right? I'm leaving those in. So there are a lot of exceptions to these rules. I mean, we all talk about the benefits of education, for instance, at the micro level, and education differences explain maybe 20-30% of income differences in the US, right? But we all still know education can be really important, right?
Yeah, 20-30%, that's a lot.
That's not nothing, right? It's
Yeah.
that's yeah. I mean, seatbelts don't guarantee you're going to survive a car accident, but you should still click it.
Yeah, yeah. You give the counter example of Brunei as well as sort of a Southeast Asian exception because
Yep.
it doesn't have basically any Chinese people in it, but they just have a lot of oil.
Yeah. So oil's a great way to get rich, right? I mean, I hope I hope all of my listeners here today find that they're living right on top of a massive oil well.
And that's really the difference too with European countries. I mean, with a country like Norway, for example, is just completely different
Yeah,
than
so Norway's a big outlier because they got all that oil, right?
they got all that oil. Exactly.
Yeah. So I didn't do any statistical gimmicks to try to adjust for that when I did this. So yeah.
Towards the end of the book, you have a chapter about aspirin. Why do
Yeah,
you have
yeah.
a chapter about aspirin in a book about immigration?
Well, because we knew for 2 centuries that aspirin worked without knowing why it worked. And I think that's the way a lot of this research in my book is. That's the state of understanding we're at, which is we know that culture persists. We know that it shapes your nation's economic future. We know that it lasts across generations in a sort of noisy way. But we don't know why it persists, right? There's a lot of game theory. You can speculate in terms of game theory. You can do micro level sociology experiments. You can wonder about use adoption studies or whatever. The answer is, why does it persist? I don't know. But I do know that it's a useful enough and a robust enough relationship that it can be used for at least some policy decisions on a modest level. So to reiterate, for 2 centuries, we knew that aspirin worked without knowing why it worked. It was only in the 1970s that someone won a Nobel Prize for figuring out why aspirin worked. So people made up stories before then. They told each other stories. Some of the people probably believed those stories. Those stories were wrong, right? You can know something works without knowing why it works. And that's the way we should treat a lot of the message of the culture transplant.
So, what about the sort of stylized example that I think a lot of people can envision? And I think they can envision it because it's certainly true for some people of the immigrant who moves to the United States and does so because they hate the country that they were leaving.
Exactly, and they come to America because they love it, right?
Yeah, but
Yeah.
they hate its government. They hate, I mean, you
Yeah,
can think
yeah.
of Venezuelan immigrants, for example, that just absolutely hate socialism and are some of the most capitalistic people
Yeah.
in the U.S. What does that counterexample do for the sort of the thesis of the culture transplant?
Well, my book's about the second generation and beyond, and not about the first generation. First generations are exceptions to the rules in so many ways, right? This is something that many migration activists can make very good points about for just that reason, right? So, first generation migrants are atypical, right? They chose to move. They choose to move to a place on average. If they have a choice, they're going to choose to move to a place where they think they're going to have a good shot at assimilating, right? Then the question is, what do their children and grandchildren look like? My book is not about the one generation short run. It's about the second, third, fourth generation longer runs. I think we should spend more time thinking about the second generation and beyond, and much less about the overstudied first generation. The long run matters.
Mm-hmm. And so, as a practical matter, for a member of Congress, for a president on the campaign trail, what does a what does an immigration system look like that takes into account the thesis of your book and puts it into action?
Well, I'd start with something. I'd start with something a lot like the points-based systems of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and then see if there's a practical way for me to add on some kind of measure of predictors of the long-run success of the children and grandchildren of those migrants, right? And one simple one would be, what is the non-natural resource GDP per capita in your country that you're coming from, right? So people who come from successful places that have large non-natural resource private sectors, they're a little more likely to be able to have children and grandchildren that are going to be net contributors to high trust, to market orientation, toward prosperity, right? So just basically, if you bring in folks, giving a slight weight, not an overwhelming weight, a slight weight to people who come from relatively prosperous, non-natural resource heavy countries, that by itself gives you a slight benefit. I wouldn't make that overwhelming. People who come from countries whose ancestors have long experience with democracy, with liberal institutions, right? So these kind of indicators are noisy, they're imperfect, but they can add a little bit of value when we're trying to improve America's long-run institutional prosperity.
And what about all of the people who come to the United States and don't follow that process, either because it's not enforced or because they don't follow? But what are what's the impact of the legal immigration in particular? And because there you're not able to put any of those point categories in place.
Well, I mean, there are sort of predictable medium to long term consequences from that if the past is prologue, right? The folks who are coming in irregularly to the U.S. On average are coming from countries with weaker institutions, countries that under these SAT score metrics are coming from countries where the average SAT scores are lower than they are in the U.S. Not in every case, but so you can kind of predict what the medium to long-term consequences of that'll be. A slight tendency, not a one-for-one relationship, but a noisy relationship that tends to place institutional quality and productivity slightly at risk over the medium to long term, right? So there are consequences to this, and politicians have to weigh this in a way that I personally don't. I like being generous to people who are coming from terrible backgrounds, terrible situations, but we should at least find a way to be candid about what are the likely medium to long run consequences of whatever immigration policy we choose or don't choose.
One other point about the SAT scores, and this is another point about the sort of American exceptionalism, perhaps. One of the things that I noticed in the back of the book, you list the SAT scores for every country, and one of the things I noticed that the U.S. This correlation is strong globally, but the U.S. has sort of a weirdly low SAT score, given its very high income. It's Spain, Portugal, and Italy all have much higher SAT scores. Poorer. And the U.S. has about the same SAT score as Vietnam. And so is this another example of just sort of the U.S. being sort of a weird special case?
Yes. I mean, if I were going to use the arguments of some of my critics, I would actually say the U.S. created its institutions under a regime that was an evil regime that I do not like, which is it locked out the votes of African Americans by and large, and those institutions were also created before the rise in Hispanic immigration over the last few decades, right? So the institutions that we're inheriting were created by a cultural group that was much more like Western Europe, and they imposed it and kept it forcibly there for a very long time. So we're inheriting a gift from the past that was created under very inegalitarian metrics, right? So that's part of, I think, why the U.S. Is outperforming its official SAT score, because the people who were part of the political community at the times it was created and enforced were hailed from Western Europe, a nation with the fairly high SAT scores by most measures, especially on the TEEP. I want to emphasize that. So basically, the U.S., one can understand that the evils of American past help explain why it is outperforming its technology history score.
And just because by global standards, the U.S. is a relatively new country.
That's possible, but there are a lot of new countries across the Americas, right? And
Yeah.
the U.S. is by far the best performer of them. So,
Sure.
yeah.
You say in the book that one reason that we know economics is a science is because sometimes it tells you things that you don't want to be true. And you say that this argument of the book is something that you don't want to be true. What did you mean by that? And what should we take away from that?
I really wish that there were some easy way to raise productivity and raise institutional quality all around the world. I wish there were some simple way to help lift people in the poorest countries up to like very high levels of productivity, and so their children don't face high risks of dying before the age of 1. But economists keep running into this brick wall, which is that we don't know how to improve institutions. We very much at all. We can preach and say, we can tell people, hey, stop, don't be communist. Hey, don't have a totalitarian dictatorship. But beyond that, we just don't have that much actionable advice. A lot of our advice, a lot of the policy advice we give when we tell countries or leaders of other countries to improve their institutions is a lot like telling someone that the way to win a gold medal in the 100-yard dash is to run faster, right? I know it's tautologically true, but it's not actionable advice. So we don't have a lot of actionable advice that can help us close the massive cross-country income gaps the world sees. You see this in the emphasis of development economics. There's like a 10 to 15-year period where the institutional economics researchers were really hoping they could find some way to improve institutions in poor countries. And then they kind of gave up on that and just kind of switched to talking about bed nets and malaria and preventing like infectious diseases, which are important things to do, but they're not going to make the poorest countries 10 times more productive. We've lost the fact that it's so hard to find ways to improve institutions in poor countries is really a humbling moment for all economists to wrestle with.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Garett Jones. This was a great conversation. I highly recommend the book, Culture Transplant. It is not very long. It is based on, oh, there we go. Yeah. We'll have a picture. We'll have a picture that'll go up right about here as well. But it's not very long. It's written in very accessible language, and is as Dr. Jones said, is based on a lot of stuff that is just sitting around in academic journals that nobody reads, and you're putting it together in a way that people can understand, and definitely thinking in a way that is different than a lot of people think on both sides of the immigration issue. And so really appreciated that perspective. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.